The city never really slept, but there were corners of it that felt forgotten after dark. The wealthy lived in tall glass towers where lights stayed on all night, while only a few streets away, shadows swallowed narrow alleys and broken street lamps hummed without purpose. In that sharp divide between wealth and want stood the Colburn estate, a mansion so large it looked like a hotel from the outside. Its walls stretched high and wide, built to keep the world out and its owner's empire safe inside. At night, the place was unnervingly quiet. The garden fountains ran softly, the marble floors reflected whatever light dared creep through, and the silence pressed on every room like a weight. By day, the estate buzzed with staff. Maids rushed between the kitchens and guest rooms. Groundskeepers trimmed hedges with quiet discipline, and the man they all worked for, Richard Colburn, drifted in and out like he owned time itself. He was in his early 50s, a self-made millionaire with the kind of sharp face that seemed carved to show authority. To outsiders, he was a man of respect, the kind newspapers like to call a symbol of hard work and grit. But to those closer, the picture wasn't so clean. His money came with an air of control, the kind that made people step carefully around him, as though his gaze alone could decide their fate. Among those staff was Elias, a young black man who worked long shifts as a cleaner. He had been at the estate for just over a year, and while most servants blended into the background, Elias was different. He carried himself with a quiet strength, though he rarely spoke unless spoken to. There was something in his eyes, a kind of thoughtfulness that made it clear he was watching the world closely, even when no one noticed him. For Elias, the work was not about pride, it was survival. Each paycheck fed not only himself but also his younger sister, who was still in school, and his mother, whose health kept her tied to their small apartment across town. Life in the Colburn estate had a strange rhythm. Staff weren't meant to linger. They were there to work and leave without making ripples. But Elias often stayed behind, long after the others had gone. The mansion's library, though rarely visited by its owner, became his refuge. There, beneath dim chandeliers and rows of untouched books, he found something the outside world rarely gave him: quiet and the possibility of learning. Most nights, when the floors had been polished and the rooms reset for the morning, Elias would sit in the corner with borrowed textbooks, tracing words with a finger and whispering lines to himself. He wanted a life beyond mops and rags, one that required knowledge instead of silence. But this small act carried its own danger. The rules were unspoken but firm. Workers were not meant to blur the line between servant and master. To linger in the library, to sit at a desk where contracts worth millions had once been signed, was to cross into a space not meant for him. And yet, Elias returned night after night, unable to ignore the pull of possibility. Richard Colburn himself had grown used to thinking of his home as a kingdom. His staff were invisible unless they failed him. The cleaner was just another figure in the background, until one night when Richard returned earlier than expected from a dinner party. The mansion was dark, except for a faint glow leaking from the library door. He walked in expecting to find a lamp left on by mistake. Instead, he found Elias sitting alone, a thick book open on his lap, his lips moving softly as though he were repeating the words in his head. It was an image that startled Richard more than it should have. The cleaner in his space, touching what wasn't his, using time he hadn't been given. For a brief moment, Richard stood silent, watching from the shadows. Elias didn't notice. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but there was determination etched into his face. He looked like someone fighting to hold on to something the world kept trying to take away. This was where their paths began to twist together, though neither of them knew how deep it would go. The millionaire and the cleaner, two men whose lives couldn't have been more different, were brought together by a moment in the dark. One had power, wealth, and the comfort of a world bent to his will. The other had nothing but the will to change his fate, even if it meant breaking silent rules. The night passed with only a few words exchanged, but there was something underneath, a current strong enough to shift the ground beneath them. Richard's eyes lingered longer than they should have, not just on the book but on the boy holding it. And Elias, when he finally looked up and realized he wasn't alone, felt his stomach twist with dread. He had been caught, and he knew men like Richard didn't like being surprised. On the surface, life at the mansion went on as usual. Breakfast trays were set, marble steps shone, and the fountains kept running. But beneath that smooth routine, a silent tension had begun to grow. Elias worked harder, more carefully, as if trying to erase the memory of that night. Richard, however, carried it with him. He replayed the scene in his mind, wondering what it meant for a boy like that to be chasing something beyond his station. The mansion itself seemed to hold its breath, as though it knew that one small spark had already been lit in its dark halls. And while everything looked normal from the outside, the truth was simple. The line between power and desperation had been crossed, and the balance was already starting to tip. The days after Richard caught Elias in the library passed in a strange haze. On the surface, nothing seemed out of place. Elias still moved silently through the mansion, wiping down the polished stair rails, emptying ashtrays, scrubbing at stains on the floor until his hands burned. Richard still floated through his routines of meetings, phone calls, and appearances at charity events where he smiled for cameras and shook hands with men just as rich as him. But something had shifted. It was quiet, hidden beneath layers of silence. Yet it charged the air with a heaviness both men could feel. Richard began to notice Elias in ways he hadn't before. He had always treated the cleaner as invisible, another tool in his mansion, useful but forgettable. Now, he found his eyes following him across rooms, wondering what he thought about while pushing a mop across the floor. He remembered the way Elias's lips moved as he read, the look of hunger in his eyes, not hunger for food, but for something bigger. That image gnawed at Richard. It unsettled him. Part of him felt offended by it, as though Elias had crossed into a world he had no right to touch. But another part, one Richard couldn't admit to himself, was fascinated. For Elias, the encounter left a different mark. He could still feel the chill of that night, the moment he looked up and saw Richard's figure in the doorway. Fear settled in his chest, the kind of fear only people in his position knew well. Fear of being punished for stepping out of line. Fear of losing the job that kept his family alive. Every time he entered the mansion afterward, he carried that dread, but he also carried defiance. The books had awakened something in him, and though he wanted to stay invisible, a voice inside whispered that he could not go back to simply scrubbing floors and lowering his eyes. The first tension came quietly. One afternoon, Richard called Elias into his office. The room was dim, heavy with cigar smoke. Richard sat behind his oak desk, a glass of whiskey untouched at his side. He asked Elias questions, not about cleaning, but about his life. Where he lived, who depended on him, what he did after hours. Elias, cautious, gave simple answers. He admitted he was studying, though he avoided the word dreams. Richard listened, his expression unreadable, before dismissing him without a word of approval or scolding. But Elias left with his stomach twisted. Why was his boss suddenly interested in him? Over the next weeks, Chard's watchfulness grew sharper. He asked other staff questions about Elias, subtle ones hidden in a casual tone. Did he talk much? Did he have friends? Did anyone visit him? The others shrugged, too busy with their own fear of displeasing the master. But Richard built his own picture in his mind. A boy, too ambitious for his station, perhaps even too bold. And beneath it all, he felt something like jealousy brewing. Not jealousy of Elias himself, but of the raw determination Richard no longer remembered feeling. It reminded him of a time when he, too, had clawed his way up from nothing. Only in his memory, he had earned every brick of his empire. He wasn't sure if Elias deserved even a chance. Outside the mansion, Elias's life bore its own weight. His sister's tuition was overdue, his mother's health worsened, and the hospital bills piled higher. Every paycheck barely covered what they needed, and the temptation to quit studying altogether clawed at him. But the thought of surrendering made his chest tighten with shame. He promised himself he wouldn't let the world trap him in servitude forever. Late at night, when the mansion was still, he kept returning to the library, though more carefully now, listening for footsteps, jumping at the slightest creak. It was during one of these nights that Richard appeared again. This time he didn't watch in silence. He stepped into the room, startling Elias, who nearly dropped the book in his hands. Richard didn't shout. Instead he asked, "What are you trying to become?" The question cut deep. Elias stammered, unsure if it was safe to answer, but Richard pressed, his voice low and sharp, as though he demanded ownership of the boy's thoughts. Elias finally muttered something about wanting a better life, about studying to pass exams that might one day open doors to university. Richard gave a slow, humorless smile and said, "Dreams can be dangerous for people like you." Those words echoed long after Richard left. Elias felt anger stir inside him, hotter than the fear that usually kept him quiet. Dangerous. The word burned. Why was it dangerous for him to dream, but not for Richard to build towers of glass and marble? Why was ambition praised in one man and punished in another? Elias couldn't stop asking himself these questions, even when the answers only made the walls feel closer around him. The mansion began to feel like a stage for their unspoken struggle. Other staff noticed the way Richard's eyes lingered on Elias, the way he sometimes called him for tasks others could have done. They whispered among themselves, wondering if the boss had taken some odd interest in the cleaner. Elias, meanwhile, kept his head down, though inside his thoughts grew louder, darker. He began to wonder if Richard's attention was less about curiosity and more about control, another way to remind him of his place. Pressure outside the mansion only tightened. One evening, Elias returned home to find his sister crying over a letter from her school, warning that she would be expelled if fees weren't paid. His mother, frail and coughing, apologized for being a burden. Elias felt his chest ache with guilt as her and helplessness. He wanted to scream, to break something, but all he could do was sit quietly holding the letter, knowing he had no way out. That night when he went back to work, his anger bled into every motion of the mop and rag. He hated the marble floors that shone like mirrors, hated the smell of expensive polish, hated the silence of a house too rich to care about lives like his. Richard, on the other hand, wrestled with his own demons. The sight of Elias in the library haunted him, but so did something else, a gnawing emptiness he rarely admitted even to himself. He had spent decades building his empire, climbing ladders, crushing rivals, and now, sitting atop his fortune, he found little left to conquer. The ambition in Elias's eyes reminded him of something he had lost, a hunger dulled by success. Instead of admiration, it filled him with bitterness. Why should this boy feel what Richard no longer could? Why should he dare to want? Their next confrontation came in the kitchen late at night. Richard had returned from a meeting, restless, his tie undone, his patience worn thin. He found Elias scrubbing dishes, shoulders tense. Without warning, Richard asked him to recite something from the book he had been reading. The demand felt like a test, a cruel performance. Elias hesitated, then muttered a few lines he remembered, his voice low, ashamed. Richard smirked, saying, "Not bad for a cleaner." The words were meant as a jab, but beneath them was something else, a challenge, perhaps even a twisted kind of fascination. Elias felt humiliation burn through him, but also defiance. He met Richard's eyes for the first time, refusing to lower them. For a heartbeat, neither man looked away, and the air between them turned sharp. As weeks dragged on, these moments multiplied. Richard toyed with Elias in subtle ways, summoning him for unnecessary tasks, asking him questions designed to unsettle, watching him with a gaze that felt heavier than words. Elias endured it in silence. But inside, resentment grew like a shadow. He began to dream less of escape through study and more of breaking free by force, though the thought scared him. At night, lying awake, he asked himself what kind of man he was becoming. The mansion itself became a character in their battle. Its vast halls seemed to amplify every unspoken word, every flicker of emotion. The chandeliers glittered coldly above their silent confrontations. The walls, once Elias's refuge, now felt like a trap. And Richard, who had once thought of his estate as a symbol of his triumph, began to see it as a cage where his control was tested daily. Tension finally began to spill in ways others could see. At breakfast one morning, a maid accidentally spilled juice across the table. Richard's fury was immediate, sharp, but his eyes flicked toward Elias as though the mistake somehow belonged to him. Elias clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay quiet. Later, when the maid whispered apologies, Elias felt a wave of protectiveness he couldn't explain. He began to notice how Richard treated not just him, but all the staff, with impatience, with disdain. The anger inside him widened, no longer only about his own struggles, but about the power one man held over so many lives. The outside world offered no relief. Elias's financial troubles deepened. His sister began working part-time jobs after school, though it wore her down. His mother's condition worsened, and doctors demanded money he didn't have. Each burden piled on top of the other, until Elias felt his back breaking under the weight. Meanwhile, Richard faced his own pressures, investors pushing for more Rofit competitors snapping at his heels, whispers of scandal about past business deals that threatened to surface. His empire looked solid from the outside, but cracks were beginning to show. And into those cracks slipped his growing obsession with the boy who refused to bow completely. By the end of that season, the air between them was thick with unspoken challenge. Richard couldn't resist pushing, and Elias couldn't stop resisting. Each glance, each word, carried more weight than the last. What had begun as a chance encounter in a dark library had spiraled into a battle of wills neither man admitted aloud. The mansion's silence no longer felt like peace. It felt like the hush before a storm. The night it happened, the mansion felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself pressed down on every wall. Storm clouds gathered outside, and the wind rattled against the tall windows. Inside, the lights glowed warm but hollow, a false comfort against the tension brewing within. Elias had worked himself to exhaustion that day, cleaning floors until his arms ached. But instead of going home, he drifted again toward the library. He knew it was dangerous, knew Richard's eyes had been following him more closely than ever, but something in him refused to surrender. The books whispered to him like promises, fragile lifelines to a life he couldn't yet touch, but desperately needed. The clock in the hall struck past midnight. The house was still. Elias sat hunched in the corner, reading by the dim glow of a lamp he'd turned low. His lips moved silently, his brow furrowed with focus. For once, he felt a kind of calm, as though the storm outside belonged to another world. But the creak of the library door shattered it. Richard stepped inside, his presence filling the room before he spoke a word. He wasn't dressed for bed. He still wore his dinner jacket, though the tie hung loose, his face flushed from whiskey. His eyes fixed on Elias, sharp, almost glowing in the low light. "What did I tell you?" Richard's voice cut through the quiet. Elias froze, the book heavy in his hands. He tried to stand, to stammer an apology, but Richard raised a hand, stopping him. "No excuses. I warned you." His tone was controlled, but beneath it, rage churned like thunder. Elias's throat went dry. Fear told him to put the book down, to bow his head, to beg forgiveness. But another voice, the one that had grown louder in recent weeks, urged him not to bend. His heart pounded so hard it shook his chest. "I wasn't stealing," he said, his voice low but steady. "I was just reading." The words hung in the air, dangerous, defiant. Richard's jaw clenched. He stepped closer, the smell of alcohol heavy around him. "Reading?" he spat. "You think you can just sit here, in my house, and play scholar? You're nothing but a cleaner, a servant. You don't belong here." Something broke inside Elias then. Not a snap of fear, but a crack of anger too deep to contain. His whole life had been filled with voices like Richard's, telling him what he couldn't be, where he didn't belong. His mother's pain, his sister's tears, his own dreams crushed under other men's power. It all came rushing up, raw and unbearable. He set the book down slowly, his hands trembling, not from fear, but from fury. "Rich," Ard noticed the shift. His eyes narrowed. "Don't look at me like that," he said, voice tightening. He reached out suddenly, grabbing Elias by the arm, his grip bruising. "You need to learn your place." The moment snapped. Elias shoved him back, harder than he intended, but Richard stumbled only a step before his anger exploded. "You dare put your hands on me!" he roared, lunging forward. The struggle was quick, clumsy and violent. Richard, older but fueled by rage, swung at Elias, striking his jaw. Pain flashed white across Elias's vision, but adrenaline surged, giving his body strength he didn't know he had. He grabbed Richard's arm, twisting, the two men grappling amid the polished shelves and scattered books. The storm outside howled louder, rain pounding against the windows like fists. Inside, the library turned into a battleground. A lamp toppled, shattering, plunging part of the room into shadows. The two figures wrestled, breath ragged, hearts hammering. Richard cursed, his voice hoarse with rage. Elias's chest burned with both fury and fear. He hadn't meant for it to go this far, but now there was no way back. In the chaos, Richard reached for the edge of his desk, fumbling for something, anything to gain control. His hand landed on a heavy glass paperweight. He raised it high, eyes blazing, ready to bring it down. Time slowed. Elias saw it coming, saw the intent in Richard's face, and in that moment, survival screamed louder than everything else. He lunged, his hands grabbing Richard's wrist, shoving with all the strength desperation could summon. The sound came sharp and sickening. The paperweight slipped, crashing against Richard's own temple with brutal force as his arm was driven backward. For a split second his body stiffened, eyes wide with shock, before his knees buckled. He crumpled to the floor, the glass weight rolling from his limp hand. Silence fell, broken only by the storm outside and Elias's ragged breathing. Elias stood frozen, chest heaving, staring down at the man who had once seemed untouchable. Richard lay on the carpet, blood pooling beneath his head, spreading slowly across the expensive fibers. His face was pale, slack, unrecognizable without its mask of power. Elias's hands shook violently, his body trembling from head to toe. He hadn't planned this. He hadn't wanted this. But it had happened. A flood of emotions crashed over him. Terror, disbelief, a desperate urge to undo what had just unfolded. His mind screamed at him to move, to do something, but his legs felt like stone. He knelt beside Richard, pressing trembling fingers against his neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. The truth hit him like ice. Richard Colburn was dead. Panic surged. The mansion suddenly felt too big, its walls closing in. Elias's thoughts raced wildly. Should he run? Call someone? Pretend it never happened? But every option ended the same, in ruin. He imagined police storming his apartment, his sister's face twisted in fear, his mother weeping in a hospital bed. He imagined headlines screaming his name, branding him as nothing but a killer. For a moment, denial tried to take hold. Maybe Richard wasn't gone. Maybe he'd wake up if Elias just waited. But the blood kept spreading, dark and steady, and the stillness of the body on the floor left no room for hope. The storm outside seemed to roar louder, as if the world itself bore witness. Elias staggered to his feet, clutching his head with blood-stained hands. His heart pounded so hard it hurt, every beat screaming at him that his life had just changed forever. In a haze, he began to move. He grabbed the fallen lamp, setting it upright though the bulb was broken, as if fixing the room could undo what happened. He tried to wipe his hands on his clothes, but the blood smeared deeper. He thought about cleaning, about scrubbing away the evidence like he'd scrubbed floors 1,000 times. But this was no stain on marble. This was a life. He stumbled toward the door, then stopped, looking back one last time. Richard's body lay still, the room that had once been a sanctuary of ambition now stained with violence. Elias's chest tightened with something beyond fear, grief, maybe, or the weight of finality. He whispered to himself, a broken plea. I didn't mean to. The aftermath began in silence, but chaos brewed just beneath. Every sound in the mansion seemed louder now, the ticking of the clock, the groan of the storm, the creak of the floors under his feet. Elias felt haunted by the echoes of his own actions, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. He pressed his fists to his eyes, trying to push it all away, but the image of Richard falling replayed again and again, merciless, unforgettable. The crime was done. What remained was the crushing question of what came next. The hours after Richard's death blurred together like fragments of a fever dream. Elias couldn't tell how long he sat in the dark library with the body at his feet. Sometimes he thought minutes had passed. Other times it felt like years. The storm outside raged, wind lashing the windows, thunder rolling like judgment. His body shook, not from the cold but from the weight of what he had done. He pressed his palms against his face, but the blood on his skin smeared across his cheeks, the smell metallic and sharp, refusing to let him forget. Fear drove him first. His mind clawed at solutions, hide the body, run from the mansion, pretend none of this had happened. He thought of dragging Richard's body somewhere it wouldn't be found. Maybe the cellar, maybe the woods behind the estate. But even as he imagined it, he knew it was useless. Men like Richard Colburn did not go missing without the world noticing. His absence would send shockwaves. Elias's every move would be questioned. He was already trapped, even before the law reached him. As dawn broke, the storm eased, but the silence it left behind was worse. Elias forced himself to leave the library, each step heavy, dragging him toward an uncertain end. He scrubbed his hands raw in the sink, the water turning red, then pink, then clear, but the stains in his mind didn't fade. Every surface in the mansion seemed to accuse him. The polished banisters, the spotless floors, the mirrors that reflected his hollow eyes. He was the cleaner, the one who erased every trace of dirt. Yet this stain would never be washed away. When Richard's body was discovered later that morning by one of the maids, the scream cut through the halls like a blade. Staff rushed to the library, their gasps echoing against the walls. The master of the house, the man who had ruled over them with an iron presence, now lay lifeless on the carpet, blood dried beneath his head. The sight shattered the air of untouchable power that had always clung to him. He looked smaller in death, almost human, but no less terrifying for what his end meant. Police swarmed the estate within the hour. Sirens wailed outside as uniformed men marched through the gates, their radios crackling. Reporters soon followed, cameras flashing against the iron gates, shouting questions no one inside could answer. The mansion transformed from a symbol of wealth to a crime scene. Yellow tape cut across marble floors, evidence markers dotted the library, and whispers spread like wildfire. For Elias, denial crumbled quickly under the weight of reality. He couldn't run. He had nowhere to go. He couldn't hide. The mansion had already become a cage. His clothes, his fingerprints, his very presence in the house tied him to Richard's death. When detectives questioned him, he tried to explain, his words stumbling out in broken fragments, that it wasn't planned, that it wasn't murder, that it had all happened so fast. But every word sounded hollow, every plea drowned beneath the blood on his hands. The guilt gnawed at him in quiet moments. At night, when he lay in the holding cell, the image replayed endlessly. Richard's eyes widening in shock, the slump of his body, the spreading pool of blood. Elias's dreams were filled with the sound of the paperweight hitting bone, the thud of the fall. He woke, gasping, drenched in sweat, his chest tight with panic. He told himself again and again that he hadn't meant to kill, that it was self-defense, that he had only wanted to stop the blow. But another voice whispered cruelly, "You wanted him gone. You wanted freedom, and now this is it." Outside the jail walls, his family bore their own weight. His sister, just 16, was pulled from class by news reporters shoving microphones in her face. She cried on the school steps, her book slipping from her arms, unable to form words as cameras captured her pain. His mother, frail and already broken by illness, collapsed when she heard. Neighbors helped her inside, but whispers filled the air. The cleaner's boy had killed his boss. Some spoke with pity, others with scorn. The community split in their reactions. To some, Elias was a criminal, a dangerous young man who had crossed a line no servant should ever cross. To others, his story struck a different nerve. They saw a boy who had been cornered, crushed by poverty and injustice, provoked by a man who had everything yet still says, ought to take more. The newspapers painted him as both monster and martyr, depending on who held the pen. "Millionaire slain by his own servant," screamed one headline, while another read, "Young man driven to violence by desperation." Society dissected his life, his dreams, his mistakes, as if they owned the right to explain him. The Colburn family added their fury. Richard's relatives, distant cousins, and business partners who had barely set foot in the mansion while he was alive, now arrived in black suits and bitter words. They demanded justice, their voices sharp with outrage. To them, Elias was nothing but a killer who had dared touch a man far above him. Their grief was loud, public, and filled with calls for punishment. Yet behind their cries, whispers circulated about Richard's cruelty, his controlling hand, the empire built on broken promises. But no one spoke them aloud, not where the cameras could hear. Elias's trial became a spectacle. Courtrooms packed with journalists, sketches of his face plastered across evening news. Prosecutors painted him as resentful, envious, dangerous, a servant who let ambition rot into rage. They spoke of betrayal, of trust shattered. His defense told another story, of a young man cornered, struck first, forced to fight back in a moment of fear. The jury's eyes flickered between these two portraits, one of a monster, the other of a boy crushed by forces beyond him. Through it all, Elias barely spoke. When he did, his words were quiet, weighted with regret. He didn't deny what happened. He couldn't. All he could say was that he never meant for Richard to die, that it wasn't supposed to end like this. Sometimes when he looked out into the courtroom and caught his sister's eyes, swollen from crying, his chest ached so hard he thought it would split. The psychological toll deepened with each passing day. Guilt hollowed him out, stripping away everything but the memory of that night. He thought of the books in the library, of the dreams he had whispered to himself in the dark. Now they mocked him, fragile fantasies buried beneath the weight of reality. He wondered if he had ever really had a chance, or if the world had been pushing him toward this end from the start. In the city, the case stirred deeper conversations. People argued in cafes, in workplaces, in crowded buses. Some saw it as proof that class lines were fragile, that the divide between rich and poor could erupt in violence. Others saw only crime, another reason to distrust those who served them. The Colburn mansion, once admired as a symbol of power, now stood as a reminder of tragedy, its marble floors forever stained. The ripple effects touched everyone. Other staff at the estate were shaken, many leaving their jobs in fear or disgust. Some confessed quietly to reporters about Richard's harshness, but their words were buried beneath louder stories. Investors in his companies panicked, stocks trembling under the weight of scandal, and in quiet homes across the city, families like Elias's whispered their own fears about what dreams cost, about how easily survival could twist into ruin. In the end, the crime was not just one man's death, nor one boy's mistake. It was the fracture of a fragile balance, the tearing open of truths most preferred to keep hidden. The guilt to tilt, grief, the fury. They spread like cracks in glass, reaching farther than anyone could have imagined. The trial came quickly, though for those involved, it felt like an eternity. The courtroom filled with whispers, curious strangers, reporters with sharp pens, and neighbors who once praised James Caldwell, but now eyed him with suspicion. The weight of the charges hung in the air like smoke. James sat at the defense table dressed in a tailored suit, his hands clasped together, his eyes hollow. For a man who had once controlled so much with wealth and influence, he looked small, stripped of the aura that money had always wrapped him in. The crime he committed had erased the veneer of respectability. David's name was spoken with reverence during the proceedings. His dream, his sacrifice, his quiet strength, it all painted him as more than a victim. He became a symbol of what so many people in the community knew too well. The struggle of working hard, staying invisible, and still facing exploitation by those above. Witnesses came forward with stories of his kindness, how he shared books with children in the neighborhood, how he tutored others after long hours of cleaning, and how he never complained despite his exhaustion. His life became larger than just his story. It was a mirror of injustice. The jury heard everything. The anger in James's voice the night of the crime, the calculated way he had tried to cover it up, and the clear imbalance of power between him and David. His lawyers argued that he had snapped, that it wasn't premeditated, that stress had driven him to a breaking point. But the prosecution painted a clearer picture. This wasn't a man who lost control, but a man who believed his control gave him the right to take another life. The jury's verdict was swift, guilty of second-degree murder. The sentence was heavy, though no years behind bars could balance what had been lost. James Caldwell was led away in handcuffs, the sound of chains rattling against the floor echoing through the room. For the wealthy businessman who once looked down on others, prison was a world he could not buy his way out of. His empire crumbled in his absence. Business partners cut ties, properties sold for scraps, and his name became more curse than legacy. For David's family, the verdict brought no celebration, only a bitter kind of closure. His mother sat quietly outside the courtroom, clutching the same Bible David used to study late into the night. She had prayed for justice, but justice did not bring her son back. His younger siblings still left his chair empty at dinner, still whispered his name before bed, still believed he was watching over them. The loss carved into them deeper than any sentence handed to his killer could fill. The community around them felt the shock ripple out. Some people admitted they had looked the other way too often, ignoring the sharp lines between wealth and poverty, between privilege and survival. Others took David's story as a warning, a reminder of how ambition can put you in danger when power decides you don't belong. There were vigils held, scholarships created in David's name, and small attempts to make something good grow from tragedy. His name became tied to resilience, a reminder that dreams can outlive the dreamer. The story reached further than the neighborhood. Newspapers ran headlines about the millionaire and the cleaner, spinning it into a tale of greed and injustice. Debates sparked about race, class, and the dangers of unchecked privilege. Some said the trial showed progress, that even the rich could be held accountable. Others said it revealed how fragile justice still was, how close the case had come to being swept under the rug, until community outrage forced the truth into the light. James's downfall became a lesson, though not the kind he would have chosen. Stripped of power, He was just another inmate, haunted by the memory of what he had done and by the knowledge that no amount of money could undo it. Inside prison walls, he faced the same hierarchy he once used to control others, but now he was at the bottom, exposed, fragile, forgotten. The larger themes of morality and human behavior lingered long after the trial ended. People wondered what pushed James so far. Was it jealousy, fear of being outshined, or the simple arrogance of thinking another man's life had less value? It revealed the darker side of power, how easily it can corrupt, how quickly it can turn respect into control and control into violence. And David's part of the story showed the opposite. The quiet dignity of someone who had so little, yet still gave more than he received. The crime forced people to reflect on themselves. How often had they judged someone for their job? How often had they overlooked the intelligence and worth of someone simply because they cleaned floors or carried bags? The story asked uncomfortable questions about justice. Is it only justice when someone is convicted, or does true justice mean creating a world where men like David don't have to suffer under men like James in the first place? In the end, there were no real winners. A promising life was gone, a family broken, and a man who had everything threw it all away because of pride and fear. The world moved on, but the echoes remained. In the scholarship fund in David's name, in the whispers of students studying late into the night, and in the quiet prayers of his mother who still left his light on as if he might walk back through the door. The conclusion of this story was not neat or satisfying, because real life rarely is. It left behind scars, lessons, and questions that no verdict could fully answer. But in the silence that followed, one truth stayed clear. Power can destroy, but the human spirit, like David's, has a way of shining long after the darkness has tried to bury it.